That's good. Henry, can you hear me okay here? Okay, that's good. I'm going to minimize you. I can't do that. Okay. Why are you not showing up here? Try this again. Get these glitches here. It's everything disappeared. What are you doing? My entire presentation disappeared. Let's do this, since I have a glitch going on my computer right now that I need to solve. Take a moment. I want you to, everyone in your group, to introduce yourselves. Important thing you're going to need to do in preparation for this weekend. We have a quiz this weekend, and you will need to find a time to group member A and B. So make sure you know which letter you are. Group member A is taking the quiz with group number B, and group number C is taking the quiz with group number D. So you want to arrange a time to get together. And I want you to spend a minute chatting about, make sure you sit together with, that's Kamala, right? Make sure you sit together with your group members here. You make sure you guys sit together with your group members as you come in. Liz, right? Yeah. Right, so, and so figure out a time when you guys can meet this weekend after Saturday. The quiz will be posted at noon on Saturday, between Saturday and Monday, when A and B can meet and C and D can meet. Just needs to be those pairs. And then I want you to chat about some experience you've had previously working in groups that worked well, just something that you had, experiences that worked well in groups while I try to solve our presentation issue.
Anytime.
So Henry, you're going to need to coordinate with your partner there. Email them offline. You guys can get together on Zoom if you're still quarantined.
Yeah, I'm texting a person in my group.
Okay, I was like,
yeah.
Okay. It seems to be working. Have you guys coordinated? You guys got yourselves a time to meet? Yes? You guys chatted about, everyone shared something that works well that they've experienced in groups? That's good. And everyone is sitting where they're supposed to sit, right? You guys only need to worry about meeting between Saturday at noon and Monday. Those are the times you need to meet. Yes.
Monday at what time?
The quiz is due at 9 p.m. on Monday, so before 9 p.m. on Monday. Yes. Does that answer your question? Paris, does that answer your question? Okay, good.
oh, exactly.
And what I'll do, Henry, is I'll just share my whole screen here. That's the way I'll do this. hopefully that'll work for you. Can you see my whole screen? You want to give me a thumbs up on that? Okay, great, thanks. Okay. All right, do we have coordination accomplished here? Sorry about my glitch at the start of class here. So hopefully you guys are all seated together and we're all good on that. And yeah, let's get ourselves started. It was a great pleasure. I tell you, when I scheduled this class this semester, I'm like, are you really going to try to do a field trip in March? It could be really, really bad. And I feel blessed that we had the weather we did have. It was very, very fortunate that we had like the most beautiful day so far for our field trip. And I hope folks enjoyed that. All right. So having done our little intro here, by the way, what I'd like to do from here on out is basically sit in this arrangement because there's a lot of stuff we're going to do with groups and stuff, a lot of coordination that needs to be done. And so let's please just sit in this arrangement from here on out, and that will be helpful to us. So two things I want to do today. There are a bunch of details I want to talk about getting us ready for our projects. Getting us ready for Thursday. So I'll say a few words about those. The introductions were actually what we just did. So we'll reverse the order on those. Hopefully you had a chance to say hello to each other, greet each other. These are folks you're going to spend some time with this semester. So it'll be fun. But I want to talk today about two major things. I got to do some catching up on biogeochemical cycles, but I think I'm actually going to talk a little bit about growth and development models first, and hopefully land on talking about IPAT and maybe give us a chance to chat a little bit about story of stuff as it relates. So that's where we're headed. First, on details. So we're sitting together. You guys have already accomplished the first bullet point under there, hopefully. And this is the thing. You have to be very careful about reading the instructions about how quizzes are run on the syllabus. There are quite a few details on those. The bottom line is I never do these quizzes in class because it wastes class time, and also because I never want to constrain the amount of time people have available to do quizzes. Different people take different amounts of time to do stuff, and I don't like to give people timed assignments because I don't want to test how fast people could do something. But here's the thing, when you schedule time to get together with your partner, if you're someone who feels like you need a little bit of extra time to do stuff, budget that time. The basic bottom line here, which you should read carefully about because this relates to Oberlin College's honor code, is there are two sections of the quiz. There's a section that you actually take with your partner collaboratively. So you talk about the questions and your answers. You're both doing the quiz on it. So if you had some disagreement, you're like, no, I really think the answer is this. It's okay, you could put different answers down, but I'm trying to give you an opportunity to collaboratively think about that. If you want to get together ahead of time and do some studying together, that's great too. And then with both of you still present together, you do the individual portions of the quiz. No one leaves until both of you have completed that, the individual quiz. Now, if one of you completes first, that's fine. That person can just work on something else on their computer. But that's why I'm saying make sure you budget enough time so that you can stay together. So you don't have someone who says, well, I got to rush off and do something else. The person who's done can do something else on their computer. That's fine. But the whole point, this is the honor code. You guys are basically proctoring each other during the quiz. You're staying together for the entirety of the quiz. Does everyone understand that? Like I say, it's described in detail in there, but that's how the honor code works. We don't need to waste time in class doing it. You guys are doing it outside of class. And I'll say this about the quiz. These quizzes are multiple choice. There's many ways we assess your learning in this class. And the point of these quizzes is basically just to see, are you getting the information out of the reading? If you study the reading questions, if you've taken a good look at the overheads, which I post, and if I don't post, you poke me and I post them then. If you understand what we've talked about in class and you understand the answers to the questions in the reading, you'll do really well in these quizzes. So if you want to study for them, review the questions for the readings and review the overheads for class, review your notes, and you'll do well. But this is about, your ability to retain, learn what's in the readings. There's some application in there too. I'll ask you questions that ask you to think. but those are multiple choice. Obviously, there are a lot of other assignments in this class which are testing other aspects of your thinking. So they're just designed to do that. Are there any questions on the quiz? Do be sure to read the instructions in the syllabus before you take it. But any questions right now about them? They're on Blackboard. So you're going to click a button. You don't want to click those buttons until you start taking them. I think I'll post a practice quiz though, so you get a sense of what kind of questions I'll ask. So I'll let you know when there's a practice quiz posted, and that'll allow you to sort of calibrate your thinking and see what kind of questions I ask. And I'll almost certainly ask at least one question from the practice quiz on the real quiz. So there's a little bonus for you for doing that, for taking the practice quiz. But you can take the practice quiz on your own. You don't need to have anyone else around when you do that. But for the real quizzes, you need, and they don't count, the practice quizzes, they're just practice. Any questions? No questions. All right, cool. All right, so very special class, next class. When you come into class, there will be 5 people plus me up here. And these are local people who are here. I'll flip to this next overhead for a second. These are some major figures in the local sustainability movement, people who are doing really important work, playing leadership roles in sustainability in Oberlin. And you have the opportunity to ask them questions. Not only do you have the opportunity, you have the responsibility, because what I'd like to do, what I've told them is they're going to say a little bit about themselves at the start of class, but I want to leave the bulk of class for you guys to do Q&A with these people. So it's really interactive. And so you are assigned to come up with 3 questions. And there's a document posted together with the readings. Those are the readings for next class. There's a link together with the readings for where you should write down your questions before class. Obviously, creating questions after they're here isn't that useful in terms of being able to ask them those questions. So do the readings. There's a little bit of bio on each of these folks that's also posted together with the readings for next class. And write down, 3 questions. It can be for any of them. It can be general questions, but if you can target them towards individuals, write down the name of the person. If you've got a question for Greg Jones, who's our energy advocate, about his experiences working with the Oberlin community, write down your question for him. If you've got a question for Linda Arbogast, who's the city sustainability coordinator, ask a question specifically for her. I'll say something about the readings very briefly. These readings are obviously they're hyper local. One is the climate action plan for the city of Oberlin. It's a long document, but it's mostly pictures, frankly. It's a sort of a glossy document. 83 pages, but you can get through it pretty quickly because it's something that's designed to be sort of flipped through and that sort of thing. But I want you to get a sense of the commitment that this city has made to addressing climate change. We're going to read some other documents on even more recent documents a little bit later on the city's commitment to climate change. But this is an overview of what's going on in the city. The college has its own environmental policy implementation plan. I want you to give that a careful read. There's a very short little piece on Oberlin in general. So yeah, that's what I want you to do to prepare for next class. And it'll be a good discussion if you guys come with good questions. Any questions on that? All right, cool. So that's this Thursday. This is the Sustainability Roundtable. Next Tuesday's class, we're going to do a workshop on community voices. And since Thursday's class is going to be the panel, I won't have time to talk about it then. It's going to be important for you to do the preparation reading for that, because during class, we are both going to, Harriet will be here as well, and I may have another student leader with us here. But we're going to talk through basically the way in which interviews will be done this semester. And each of you will conduct 3 interviews over the course of the semester. The first one with a classmate here, the second one with an Oberlin student who's engaged in the Oberlin community, and the third one with a member of the larger Oberlin community. And the groups you're in right now, as the titles of those groups suggest, are focused on sort of different topics, different interview topics for the community interviews. But it's going to be important for you to prep for that by doing the readings associated with that. There's also the first of these sort of modeling modules due next Tuesday for this research we talked about. So that is an assignment that you need to do. On Thursday's class, I don't need to say that much about it, but Thursday's class, we're going to have a guest in Cindy France, who's in psychology, who's been very involved in the sort of quantifying the impact of community voices on the Oberlin community. And she's going to talk a little bit about how that has affected the Oberlin community, as well as just generally on how important understanding psychology is if you want to address environmental issues. And at the end of next week, just give you a longer term heads up, we're going to schedule, Harriet and I will be scheduling conferences with each group. So we'll actually, it's already posted. If you look online, there's a link to conference schedules. So your group, not individuals, your group is going to need to schedule a time with us, and say a little bit more about that on Tuesday. I'm just giving you a heads up on that because we do want to get that scheduled. But in that conference, you're actually going to interview one of your classmates, and you need to prepare some questions for that. I'm just giving you sort of a long-term, here's what's coming in the next couple of weeks, just so you guys are clear on that, and then I can answer any questions you may have. Any questions? Yes, Dan.
All this stuff is like on the
Everything I'm saying is described in the schedule. There's nothing I'm saying that is not also described in the schedule. Yeah, if you just sort of go through the schedule, click on what's posted for each day, you'll have all information you need. Yeah, just want to make sure that if there are any questions on it, I'm answering this. All right. All right, so we kind of did that, so we're not gonna do that. So a bunch of readings you guys did for today. I don't want to take the time to sort of like get some feedback right now because we have a bunch of stuff to cover, but we will be talking about these different readings as we go on. They're all by people who play a really important role in sort of, or have played a really important role in thinking about human relationships with resources, resource growth, population issues. All of those things are sort of addressed in these readings. But I'll take just a brief step back for a moment, a little bit of refresher here to sort of start where we left off last time, in saying that we've got these basic scientific principles that apply to all systems. All systems need a flow of high quality energy because they're degrading that energy to low quality heat because of the second law of thermodynamics. The Earth receives high quality energy from the sun and emits heat out into space. All of those cycles of water and wind and everything else is sort of driven by that energy flow that occurs through the Earth. Those flows, that is, drive these cycles of material through the Earth. That's just kind of fundamental to the way the system works. And that's true at these different scales. We talked about ecosystems being similar. They are driven by solar energy coming in. A little bit different from the Earth in the sense that they may have material input and outputs, unlike the Earth, which really doesn't have much in the way of material inputs and outputs. But nevertheless, same basic principles of conservation of matter, second law of thermodynamics, first law of thermodynamics. That sort of explains food webs, that sort of thing. Individual organisms, same deal. In our case, if we're not plants, we're getting our energy from either animals or from plants that receive their energy from the sun at some point. So again, just pointing out that these basic concepts are so important to understand because they apply to all systems. And we've developed an economy that in some ways doesn't fully recognize that these are the rules, that a sustainable system needs to deal with these basic rules of material flows and energy cycles. And again, this is a bit of repeat, so I won't talk again about how you lose energy as you go up. The arguments for vegetarianism, eating lower on the food chain, you're using less solar energy to support you, doesn't take as much of the globe's resources to support you if you eat lower on the food chain. In a general sense, this increase, which is connected with today's discussion about growth, of people early in our history requiring very little energy to basically support themselves, whereas modern human society using massive amounts of energy, because it's not just about the food we're taking, but all the transportation, the heating, everything else. So there's a lot of energy used per person on this planet. And of course, that's different for different people on the planet. And hopefully we'll talk about that too, because this is sort of generic human beings on the planet. But yeah, very different levels of resource. Okay, so that's all kind of context from last class that we talked about. That's a bit of a repeat. I now want to talk about that sort of from like a historical perspective, because today we are living, obviously everyone in the world experiences the world around them as being like normal. This is what we grew up with. I mean, obviously there are changes that occur and things that make things non-normal, but for our lives, we've been experiencing this situation that's very different from the lives of our ancestors. For the last 50,000 years of modern human history, if we're going to call the last 50,000 years modern human history, I mean, 50,000 years ago, human beings were basically just like they are now, except they hadn't figured out how to do a lot of the things that we figured out how to do. So for most of our history, we were just like any other organism living in an ecosystem, in the sense that we were pretty much entirely dependent on the flow of sunlight coming into the ecosystem around us, producing the food, the fuel, the fiber, the things we needed to support our culture. Vast majority of human history, we were like other organisms. That's the way we survived, is on solar energy and local material cycles. That's the way things worked for us. Major turning point a couple hundred years ago. And in fact, human beings have been mining fossil fuels probably for thousands of years. There's evidence that people in China had discovered coal and were using it to heat. And so it's not like fossil fuels are brand new, but the big turning point, and this relates to the assignment you did for last class, was when human beings figured out how to take fossil fuels and turn them into mechanical forms of energy, which could be used to harvest more fossil fuels. What is that? When you figure out how to take something and use that thing to do more of that same thing, what do we call that? We do call it exponential growth, but what else do we call it? What's that a picture of? Yes. Yeah, Martin, that's positive feedback. That's positive feedback. And almost everything about our culture today is a direct consequence of that that feedback. And I happen to have up there a little image of coal coming out of a coal mine, because that was our first major project with fossil fuels. But that translated into mining, oil and everything else. Huge turning point in human history, because up until that point, human society was basically constrained. The size of human society, the growth of human society was constrained by how much sunlight was coming in, how good we were at growing crops that converted that sunlight into food, and how good we were at recycling the material within our farmland so that we maintained production with that solar energy coming in. Everything changed. Everything about human society changed when we introduced that feedback, where we're now subsidizing. It's not just fossil fuel. It's not just solar energy going into our farms and the rest of our culture. It's a subsidy. It's ancient sunlight trapped in the form of fossil fuels. So a stock of stored ancient sunlight rather than the immediate sunlight coming in. And it basically decoupled human society from the constraints that sunlight had imposed prior to that, because we got this new energy source. And with this new energy source, we have this massive growth of just about everything, which is the topic of today's discussion, among other things. And it influences the changes we've seen in biogeochemical cycling. So this changed everything. The introduction of this fossil fuel loop and everything else about our society. Massively increased food production, massively increased resource consumption, huge increases in the size of our economy. And let's be honest about this too, because I think as environmentalists, of course, we're very keenly aware of the limitations imposed by running an economy on fossil fuel, but also all the pollution and the negative impacts of pollution and the environmental injustices caused by that pollution that we're generating. So I think many of us are sort of keenly aware as fossil fuels as being really problematic for our culture. So that's all true. I believe that too. That's what I think as well. But let's be honest about the fact that the lives we live are in many ways more desirable than the lives that our ancestors lived. The fact that we can, it used to be just about everyone farmed because you needed to put all that human labor into helping to capture that sunlight to drive human society. Now, very few of us farm because we use this fossil fuel subsidy that allows very few people to produce most of our food, which means most of the rest of us can spend our time thinking and learning and contemplating the world and engaged in art and the quality of our healthcare system. Lots of fossil fuel going into running that too. So it has in many ways objectively improved the quality of life for human beings. And so one needs to be really honest in sort of considering how we've benefited while concurrently recognizing that it's fundamentally unsustainable. And we have to find a way to pull ourselves back to sustainability, pull ourselves back to living within the constraints imposed by nature, but ideally in some sort of a way that does not, that still maintains the kind of quality, at least the most desirable aspects of the quality of life that we've developed. Dan.
I was just gonna ask, like, how exactly can we tell that we actually have to?
Well, that's a really, really, really good question. And I want to get back to that question, Ted, because I think that is a really fundamental question. And like I said, I don't want to get too deep into it now, but there is most certainly a relationship. I can't avoid getting into it because you asked the question. There is most certainly a relationship between having enough food to eat so that you're not hungry and being happy, and having a decent enough shelter that you're not suffering. So, if you don't have enough food, if you're living in the cold, if you're sort of desperately trying to acquire the resources you need to survive, you're not a happy person. But the reality is, and I'll show you graphs of this because people have studied this, once you achieve a certain level of resources that you're beyond being hungry, you've got a decent educational system, you've got some sort of culture that you can enjoy. Once you achieve that level, the relationship between resource consumption and happiness there's no relationship. So there is a relationship at the low level between resource consumption and happiness. But once you get beyond that, there's no meaningful relationship between resource consumption and happiness. And I think that's what we as a people, so you're getting to the punchline maybe of the whole day here with that important question you're asking. This society we have, we're just, the whole thing is based on just consuming more and more crap that we don't need, is in no way related to happiness. You look at other cultures that consume vastly less than us, and some of them are much happier than we are. So there's no relationship once you get up to a certain level of consumption. So yeah. All right. So yeah, again, but you have to recognize what it's done for us. That at some level can be thought of as positive. Like I say, growth has mostly felt pretty good for a lot of human beings. We live a lot longer than our ancestors did. We suffer a lot less from disease. I mean, we're in a particular moment when we're suffering from disease, but even then, we suffer a lot less from disease. But there is this problem which stems from our prior discussions that you can't grow indefinitely on a non-renewable resource. And as I've mentioned before, there are really two fundamental problems here. One is you're going to run out of the non-renewable resource because we're not making new fossil fuel right now. That was stored over millions and millions of years. So we're not making new fossil fuel, we're depleting it. And as I said, our thinking as environmental scientists has sort of shifted over the last 20 or 30 years. We used to think that the fundamental problem was going to be running out of fossil fuels And now I think most of us feel like the fundamental problem is that the pollution we're generating by burning those fossil fuels is gonna destroy decent living for human beings and just about everything else on the planet. Which is a worse problem. Human beings are very good at substituting one resource for another when we start to run out of a resource. We're very creative at doing that. We're much less good at solving global pollution problems, which we'll talk about later in the class as common pool resource problems. Situations where we're all either extracting from a common pool, like the air we're breathing. Everyone in the world is breathing air, sharing that breathed air. It's a common pool resource. It's common to all of us. And unfortunately, climate change is a common pool resource problem where anyone emits CO2 anywhere on the globe, and it affects everyone on the globe. So the benefits you get from emitting CO2 cause problems that are borne by everyone, and it's a fundamental conundrum within environmental studies that we'll talk about later. That's not the topic of today, but it's connected with this situation. But so depletion and pollution are just fundamentally unsustainable. So while you might say, hey, it's been a pretty good ride, it's a ride that's going to end. And we know it's going to end. And the question is, how does it end? And so I want to take just a moment or two to talk generally about the concepts of growth and the concepts of development so that we're clear and operating with common definitions as we move on in this class. So when you talk about growth, what you're talking about is one of two things, either an increase in the stock sizes. Remember, stock is stuff that's stored in a system. So increase in stock sizes or increase in through flows through a system. So you're talking about either, getting more stuff. And a good example of that, to get concrete, is number of people on the earth. The number of people has increased dramatically. There are more than twice as many people on this planet as there were when I was born. And that's kind of shocking. It's like, it's just the reality around us. But that's craziness, that in this tiny, 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 tiny little period of human history, we've doubled the human population. That's kind of insane when you think about it, the number of people. So that's one aspect of growth, is just increasing the number of things there are. In this case, we're looking at people, but the other is increases in the flow of stuff. So if you look at our economy, for instance, the amount of stuff flowing through our economy, dollars, oil, whatever, things that we use up, that get spun out. The gross national product is a measure of the flow of money through our economy. So that has also increased. So it's an increase both in the size of things and an increase in the flow of things. And oftentimes those things are related to each other. So that's growth. Growth is an increase in stuff or an increase in through flow of stuff. Important to distinguish that from development. Development is a change in the configuration of the way things are connected, the plumbing basically within a system. So how things are connected, the relative sizes of stocks within a system. So given a certain stock size, how's stuff flowing between different stocks? What's the relationship between those things? So here's just like a conceptual shift in that. That's development, where you've taken, you have the same amount of flow, but you've rearranged how it's flowing through the system. These are obviously little abstract models here. But development is really important, and I'll get concrete with that. Development addresses issues like distribution of income. So you can have the same gross national product, it's the same amount of money flowing through your economy, but that flow through could be relatively evenly distributed between different members of society, or you could have a lot of flow through a certain stocks, the super affluent people, and a very little bit of flow through other stocks, the poor people. So development is about configuration. So there are limitations to growth, but development is something that we can and need to work on and think about. How are resources distributed? How are through flows distributed? What choices are we making when we design the systems around us in terms of, where stuff is flowing and how much stuff is flowing into different places? And I think that's another huge issue within the environment, and one that is borne out in this topic that we'll talk more about in class, but one that's certainly central to environmental studies right now, which is environmental justice. And again, we'll talk at length about environmental justice, but just to give you a heads up on that too, because that's very related to the development side of this. Environmental justice deals with unequal distribution of environmental benefits. So who's benefiting from good environmental things? Unequal burdens, who's suffering from bad environmental things? And who's making the decisions? Who's making the choices about how things flow through? So the issue of environmental justice is very much an issue of development. How are resources being allocated? Who's receiving the benefits? Who's receiving the burdens? Who's receiving the benefits of good environmental stuff? Who's receiving the burdens? Plays out in everything. A lot of publicity lately about street trees, for instance. What have you guys, has anyone read any of this about street trees? How do street trees relate to the issue of environmental justice, to the issue of development I'm talking about right now? Been a lot of good articles published on this now. Yeah. Oh, interesting. That is not where I was going to go. So you're talking about the kind of trees planted, what kind of trees they plant and what pollen gets released. Okay, that's good. That's not where I intended to go, but I like it. Anyone know where I was going with that? Yes, Ben.
I think usually city trees are around the richer neighborhoods.
Yes, absolutely. If you look at, there's been a lot of recent work. It's one of the things that like geographic information systems is good for. You can map out where trees are and map out economic levels. And not surprisingly, perhaps, the communities that are most affluent tend to have the most tree cover, and tree cover provides lots of benefit. It's cooling, provides shade, provides connectedness with nature. Generally, where there are trees, generally there's an association between trees and safety. There's a lot of benefits to having trees. They suck up pollution, so that they're good at sort of cleaning the air. So a lot of benefits, but there's been a lot of data recently. Again, it's a good example of development. Where are you putting your trees in a community? And cities like Cleveland are really trying to address this issue and try to get to a point where they're retreeing lower income neighborhoods. Very, very important as we begin to think about climate change, because most of our cities in the United States are going to be a lot warmer, and shade provided by trees is an ecosystem service. That's what we'll come to talk about. This is an ecosystem service that trees provide that helps make communities more resilient in the face of climate change. It's one of the big issues we're talking about in Oberlin right now, is thinking about tree cover and the benefits. Also, when you have heavier rains, trees absorb that rain. A lot of important aspects of trees when it comes to addressing climate change. But again, how are they distributed is sort of a development issue. All right. Key concept here, very important for you to understand, as German biogeochemist by the name of Justus von Liebig, I said agricultural chemist, yeah, he's an agricultural chemist. He was trying to sort of understand, living at a time when there was this heavy migration of people to cities, again, driven largely by fossil fuels, allowing for the development of factories and less need for people to be on. You could have the same amount of agricultural production with fewer people, a big migration of people into cities. And he was noticing that there was a loss in agricultural productivity. And basically, he came up with this idea, which applies to agriculture, but really applies to many different kinds of systems. His notion was that the growth of something is going to be controlled by the resource that is in least abundance relative to the needs of that thing. So those things there can be a variety of different limits on why something grows. And again, he was focused on plants, but the concept actually applies in many different kinds of systems. But basically his argument was, what is controlling how much productivity you can get out of a piece of land, it's going to be water, it's going to be nutrients that are limiting the growth of plants. And one of his arguments was the problem of moving people into cities is you're taking food from the agricultural land and all of the nutrients embodied in that food and moving it into the city. And that those nutrients then are going to get into some water system and flow out into the ocean. They're not going to go back onto the farmland. And so the productivity of the farmland is being limited by this loss of nutrients because this food is moving to the city. Like I say, earlier in human history, though, that nutrient production by human beings would have been recycled back onto the farmland because people would have gone to the bathroom, the farm animals would have died and been harvested on the farmland. The nutrients would have been cycled from the food sources, would have been cycled within that. But his point was that's leaving the city. And so our farmlands are becoming limited by nutrients. And so people came to this understanding, well, we need to bring nutrients back onto the land. We need to apply nitrogen and phosphorus, which are the big nutrients that allow farmland to grow. They tend to be the macro limiting nutrients for agricultural productivity. We talked about that on the field trip. That's why farmers in Ohio are applying nitrogen and phosphorus to the land every year so that they can get their corn and beans to grow. The beans have the advantage of they can fix some nitrogen, so they don't need as much nitrogen, but you still need to apply phosphorus in either case. But distance can also be limited by energy. And again, I was thinking after our field trip, I probably should have been asking you about how the war in Ukraine right now is going to affect Ohio agriculture, because it is going to affect Ohio agriculture. Someone try to take a shot at that one. As we were walking around, these lands we were seeing, all this farmland, it's very much affected by the Ukraine situation. It's not independent of that. What we do here, yeah, Benner.
Russia has a very immense resource of potash, which we use for fertilizer. And also they are the biggest producers of wheat and grain.
Yes, Ukraine is a massive producer of wheat. They feed a good percentage of the world. And while last year's crop was already harvested and basically sold, there's a great deal of uncertainty in terms of whether a crop will go in the ground this summer. Obviously that is not what Ukrainians are thinking about right now. Are they going to be able to get wheat in the ground? But that's what they do. They grow an awful lot of wheat that feeds an awful lot of the world. And so the world price of wheat is going to go way up, corn as well. And that's going to actually ultimately probably benefit US farmers. But there's a balance there in the sense that our farmers are very dependent on energy. Energy is used to produce fertilizer. It's also used to run tractors. They're going to have more expenses in terms of that. But my guess is that's going to be more than compensated for the increased price of the food they'll be growing on that land. So ultimately, it probably will have some benefits for local farmers. But I'm sure local farmers around here right now are thinking about, what am I going to plant given the changes in the global market? Because this is commodity agriculture here. They're selling into a global market. And so anyway, they're definitely thinking about this, not just from the perspective of there's this horrible thing going on in the other country, but how does that affect my own decision-making process here at home? All right, good. So we can make this distinction, as you guys well understand, between renewable and non-renewable resources. And it's pretty straight up. A renewable resource, and you can think of renewable resources as sustainable resources. Important that you understand this, is energy that's ultimately derived from the flow of sunlight. Energy derived from the flow of sunlight and material that is being completely recycled. And a situation that is ultimately, I introduced a couple other concepts last class that I hope you taught, but I'll restate it now. A system that is more or less in steady state, which means that at least over some time interval, inflow and outflow are equal to each other from the system. I say over some time interval because obviously in a temperate climate like ours, we're obviously not growing much here right now in the winter, but ideally we're consuming stuff that we grew over the summer. So right now we're using up food resources. In the summer, we're going to increase food resources. So there's a little bit of scale dependence here. But at the end of the day, the inflow needs to equal outflow in order for a system to be sustainable over the long period of time. The inflow of material needs to equal outflow. The inflow of high quality energy needs to always exceed outflow. But that energy source needs to be a flow of sunlight. Now, you might say, and I'm gonna get, well, I'll go ahead, you go first, no, I'll go.
Well, yeah, I was gonna ask like about like wind, like renewable wind.
I thought you were going to go there, and I was going to answer that question. Then I thought, no, I'll let you ask the question. But that's just what I was about to answer. As I said last class, we receive this sunlight from the Earth. But remember when I showed that diagram, a very large percentage of that, most of that energy is turned into heat on the Earth. Some of it is turned into wind. Some of it is turned, so that wind is solar energy. It's sunlight that's been turned into the movement of air. As I mentioned, because the equator is always sort of pointed at the sun, the Earth receives more energy than the poles do. And what that means is that the Earth, as a energetic system, is distributing energy towards the poles to dissipate it from where it's hottest to where it's coolest. And that's what drives the flow of wind. It's what drives the flow of the circulation of water in the oceans. All of that is just solar energy. It's just sun energy that's been converted into moving water and moving air. And so when you talk about wind, and solar energy drives the evaporation of water that then falls down on the landscape and turns into water in a dam that drives hydro. So hydropower, wind power, tidal power. Well, tidal power is a little different because you got the moon rotating around, but it's all part of the solar system. Point is, think of all of those things as solar energy. It's just some of them are direct solar energy. You have a little photovoltaic panel like we looked at on the north end of campus. That's directly turning light energy into electrical energy. But a wind turbine is turning wind, which was once solar energy, into electricity. So it's all sunlight. It's just some of it has been passed through something else before it got there. Does that make sense? It's kind of important that you understand that. It's all solar energy. It's the sun that's driving the flow of water and the flow of wind. I mean, the only exception in terms of renewable is geothermal heat, where you're tapping into the mantle of the Earth. True geothermal, like you got in like Hawaii or Iceland or something like that. That's tapping into the core. And if you think about that as solar system energy, because it is sort of residual solar system energy, then it's all solar system energy anyway. All right. So a non-renewable energy. Non-renewable energy is energy that is taken from stocks of stored energy. And it is matter that is being depleted, or you're generating dead-end byproducts that are not reusable, not recyclable. And it's a situation in which outflow is greater than inflow, or outflow is less than inflow. It's not a steady state situation. I'm just trying to frame these things in terms of these ideas we discussed in terms of stocks and flows in earlier classes. Any questions? Again, we're kind of on like scientific stuff now, and some of you in AP, maybe this stuff may be quite familiar, but it's such an important basis for thinking about even things like human relationships between each other. What's possible? What's politically possible? What's economically possible? What's politically possible, economically possible, psychologically possible, ecologically possible is all based on what is sort of biophysically possible. Yeah. So I've been enjoying reviewing your feedback loop, some really neat and creative work you've done. And I want to sort of like, take a shot in these next overheads about trying to reframe a little bit of what I just talked about in terms of these feedback diagrams that you've drawn. So let's see if we can make some sense out of these. So there are feedback controls on growth. There are limitations imposed by renewable versus non-renewable resources. So you can have this feedback where population growth increases population size. But at the end of the day, that growth is going to have to be constrained by available renewable resources, because eventually we'll run out of the non-renewable resources, or we'll create pollution problems with that. So we do have this constraint on that. that form a negative feedback that's sort of acting on, so we have these constraints of what is possible in terms of our renewable resources. You know, that's just, it's a compound feedback loop where, yeah, if you just look at a population in isolation and you consider it without limitation, it will grow exponentially, but it doesn't grow without limitation. There are always limitations. And when we think about building a sustainable society, the flow of solar energy, fortunately, there's tons of solar energy flowing to the earth. We got unlimited. I mean, we've got a huge amount of energy we can tap into if we just choose to do that. It's not like we would suffer from running on solar energy. But that's not what we're doing right now. Right now, we're consuming non-renewable resources. So that's another constraint that's functioning on our population right now. And right now, that's been sort of a positive feedback because we've been expanding how much non-renewable resources we've been extracting and consuming. And that's part of the reason our population has been able to grow so rapidly in recent history, is because, again, we decoupled ourselves from this. That's what I started saying a few minutes ago, is this used to be the most of human history. This was our constraint. We were growing constrained by available sunlight. And then we figured out how to extract these non-renewable resources and take advantage of them. Problem, of course, is we're depleting that stock of non-renewable resources, and that's ultimately going to be a negative feedback on the system. Like I said, there are two problems. One is we're depleting the stock, and the other is we're generating pollution from it. So it's got those two problems. But anyways, I just wanted to sort of try to put some of these ideas that we've been grappling with in this course together, or some of the ways of thinking, some of the tools we've been exploring, so that you can see how these things play out. Any questions or comments on this? Does this make sense? Yes, good. It's at some level, it's pretty basic stuff, but like I say, what's problematic for environmental folks like me for the last 30 years is nothing I'm telling you more or less wasn't known 30 years ago. And scientists have been sort of increasingly yelling and shouting about this. Every new report that comes out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has a little bit more of a scream to it, saying, yo, this system doesn't work. We're cooking ourselves right now. This is a problem. And yet our society hasn't really acted in a way to solve this problem yet. But the basic problem is not that complicated to understand. And concomitantly, the basic solutions are not that damn difficult to understand. It's a matter of figuring out, how do you make an economic system that is so based on consumption and has such entrenched interests in seeing continued consumption? How do you transition that into something else? And at some level, that's really, at this point, that's a question of politics and psychology more than it's a question of underlying understanding of science. We understand the science. We understood the science well enough 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even, to make smart decisions. We're not driving the system based on scientific understanding. We're driving the system based on these sort of entrenched interests, which are benefiting from the positive feedback that we have here. So we have to figure out mechanisms of getting ourselves out of there. That's the challenge of our generations today, is to figure out what are the pathways out of this conundrum we've created for ourselves. And just to entertain you for a moment, I'll play a little video here, which hopefully this will play through the loudspeaker. Let's see if this works. Let's try this out. See if this works. Oh, how irritating. I really wanted to play the Impossible Hamster. It's a fun video, very short. It's not going to load for me for some reason. Okay, well, I'll send you a link to the Impossible Hamster earlier, because it's a sort of fun, sad illustration of the fundamental conundrum which much of our society is not really grappling with, which is that indefinite growth is impossible. So I get that to work. So, we've seen this growth in human population. And I'll say this, we're not going to spend that much time talking about human population. We'll talk a little bit about human population today. It's an issue that has become very, very problematic for environmentalists to talk about. And I'll just give you a little taste of that problematic nature. It has to do with individual rights, distribution of resources, and power. That's what I would say is sort of our fundamental conundrum around talking about population. Because it's almost difficult to have a conversation in environmental studies about population, because as soon as you talk about population growth being a problem, people quite correctly raise the issue of, well, is population growth a problem, or is it disproportionate consumption of different populations? And where do you go with the notion that population growth is problematic? Does that take you to a place where you begin to talk about controlling people's ability to reproduce, controlling the reproductive rights of women in particular? It becomes very problematic. It is an issue that needs to be addressed, but I think many of us, I'd say sort of the environmental movement as a whole, has landed on the position that the way to address population problems principally has to do with A, more equitable distribution of income, and B, promoting economic development for women in particular, so that they are in a position to make more decisions about reproduction. And that in and of itself will naturally reduce reproduction. Empowering women is the best way to address the population problem. But the population problem is related to all the other problem of consumption. So we can look at many, many, many things in human society that relate to energy and material use that all demonstrate the sort of exponential growth curves. If we look at oil consumption worldwide, or natural gas or coal, they exhibit these patterns of increasing growth like this. And you can express this in a variety of different ways, looking at the total amount of energy, and they do change the amount of energy we're using for different things. Biofuels, things like people heating their house with wood, for instance. I mean, now we have more sophisticated biofuels, but that's decreased as people have shifted to the non-renewable fossil fuels. But like I say, if you look at our economy exhibits that same pattern of growth because it's so contingent on energy flows. As I mentioned before, the sort of debate, there's this enormous debate right now, which you guys are probably sensitive to, about all these sanctions have been imposed on Russia. The one thing everyone's been sort of hesitant to touch is, are we going to stop buying their damn oil? And that's because this flow of energy is so fundamental to running all of our economies. Gasoline prices went up 11 cents yesterday. That's insane. That's insane. The price of a gallon of gas went up by 11 cents over the last 24 hours. And that has everything to do with the sort of constraint we're experiencing. And it has to do with why people are scared about closing off Russian oil, because the world economy right now is contingent on this flow of Russian oil. And it gets very complicated even in terms of domestic politics, because I think a lot of the people, I don't know what my opinion is worth. I think we should, I think we probably should ban Russian oil. But part of the debate in the United States is some of the people who are very much in favor of banning Russian oil are partly in favor of banning Russian oil because they're hoping it will lift environmental regulation on fossil fuel production in the United States, opening up the Arctic Wildlife Reserve to harvesting more oil. There's a lot of the same people who are arguing, let's shut off Russia. That's one group, and there's sort of left and right who's making that argument. But a lot of the people more on the right are like, yeah, this is a reason why we want to take all regulation off harvesting fossil fuel in the United States so we can produce all our own oil. So very, very complicated stuff going on there because the economy is so dependent on energy consumption and has experienced that same pattern of growth. And the fact that humans' population is increasing, we're expanding over the landscape. Well, that has implications on species. There are many reasons why we're losing species, and we'll talk more about that, why we've had such a massive increase in species extinctions. But, the biggest single factor is the land that was previously occupied by ecosystems that provided homes for these species is now occupied by human beings. So they've lost habitat. And obviously many of these species are dependent on whatever habitat they adapted to live in. So that's a principal reason for the growth of species extinction. Obviously, we see this related growth in CO2 in the atmosphere over time as well, all part and parcel of the growth of just about everything right now. Extreme weather events, which are a function of that changing climate, exhibit that same pattern of increase over time. World water use. Again, I'm just sort of going through the litany of everything's related to everything else here in terms of these exponential growth patterns. Okay, so here's where we get to, who was it who brought up the issue of happiness? I'm trying to remember who that was. Okay, right, it was Dan. Okay, so here's where we get to happiness. Relationship is not there for happiness, guys. It's not there. So if our objective as a human species seems like a reasonable objective, right? Let's say that what we wanted to do as a human species was to make people happier, make them more satisfied. That's not related. Average income in the United States, people who say that they're very happy, there is not a strong correlation between those two. If our goal is to make people happier, having people consume more crap that they don't need does not make them happier. It's very, very clear. It's not ambiguous, this relationship. There is no relationship between those two things. And that's true. That's true globally as well. And this is where we get into what I was talking about before. So this is there's different ways people measure happiness, different happiness indexes. So the data are not completely consistent from slide to slide because different indices have been used. But here's percent of people who are highly satisfied, and this is per capita GDP. So how much money is flowing through an economy expressed per person. And this is super interesting to me because this graph is created with the scatter plot, but it's also colored by different sort of different continents, different countries and different continents. And to me, this is just super, super interesting. And I want to just give you a moment to sort of take that graph in, and I'll take a couple comments on what you're seeing in this graph here. What do you guys notice? What stands out to you? What's interesting about this graph to you?
It's like less related to the actual percentage of the graph, and you think that they didn't put any like there's names for most of the countries except for like the average. Why didn't they put names?
I think it would have been too crowded because there are too many of them. So I think it mostly has to do with noisiness, but it's a good point. They're all together in a line, you know. They're more clustered. Yes.
You get past a certain per capita GDP, it kind of spreads out.
Yeah, so that's one important point that if you were just looking at this part of the graph here, you'd probably say there's a decent relationship, there's a decent correlation. So there's a minimum per capita below which there really is a pretty strong relationship between degree of satisfaction. And that goes back to the point I was making earlier. If you're hungry, if you're having trouble educating your kids, if you don't have decent housing, there really is a relationship. As you incrementally increase those things, you really do increase your satisfaction. So there really is an honest to God relationship. But beyond that level, there's not a relationship. But what else do people notice on here? Yeah.
The trend line sort of like makes it look like there still is no relationship.
Well, they just fitted a curve to it, but you could, if you pull off that trend line, it looks super noisy. You know, it does. I think the point of having a relationship is it saturates. It's a saturating relationship. There's a relationship early on, and then beyond that, it saturates. So that is a fitted line. If you sort of like calculated an R squared, for those of you who are statistical, for the low end and the high end, you'd have a very low R squared for that portion of the curve, because there ain't much relationship there between them. Yeah.
It looks like Latin America. Just like,
Yeah.
like you said that there wasn't really different. Like it kind of looks like it would look a lot less noisy if you like took Latin America.
That's,
I don't know.
it would look less noisy. Well, I want to stick on this idea of different countries. It looks like different, or cultures, let's say, it looks like different cultures are following differently on this, right? Which to me is really interesting, because that's much more of a cultural issue. It looks like there are certain cultures that are just happier than other cultures, or conversely, there are certain cultures that are just less happy than other cultures. This is part of their psyche. They're just not as happy people for whatever reason. It has to do with their culture. I mean, in general, it looks like the Eastern Europeans are just, you can give them more money. Maybe there's a little bit of relationship there, but in general, they're just not as happy as people living in Latin America. Latin Americans seem to be pretty happy with less resources. So there's a lot of cultural stuff going on here. Not surprising that, you know, what makes people happy in this world has a lot to do with, you know, sort of the culture, that rather than like how much stuff they're consuming. Anyway, important to sort of understand those relationships, and the fact that that's, if what we want to do is optimize people's happiness, more stuff, increasing the through flow of stuff is not going to make people happier. Expanding the GDP, which by the way is what every single politician runs on at some level, is I'm going to make the economy grow. That's what every single politician at some level is running on, is I'll make the economy grow. Well, that's not necessarily going to make people happy. Okay, so we talked about this situation, which is problematic. That sort of you know, the dependency of us on fossil fuels, on increasing stuff, the exponential growth. Key question is, and we'll return to this multiple times in the semester, is we know that the pattern of any organism growing on a non-renewable resource tends to look like this. The population goes up, and then as the resource is depleted, the population ends up coming down. This is sort of a classic Hubbert's curve, connects with your reading. King Hubbert, who sort of first outlined that as a thing for fossil fuel in particular. So that's problematic. This is a pretty curve where the population goes up and then goes down slowly. It can be a lot more catastrophic than that in terms of running out of resource. But the real question for us, and the one we'll be sort of dealing with as we move on in this class, is this question about how do we sort of transition back to a system that's growing on sunlight, but recoupling human society with natural flows and cycles, transitioning to renewable energy, redeveloping complete material cycles, living within limits. This is the pattern of an organism growing on a renewable resource, where it achieves some maximum level and then stabilizes. So important to understand that as sort of that's at some level where we need to head. How we get there, the particulars of it, the politics involved in that, the psychology involved in that. Lots of debate about what our best pathway is forward on that. But just from a biophysical sense, that's what we need to do if we're going to get to a sustainable situation. I want to talk a little bit about these models of stability. Yes.
So would the sun be considered limited renewable resource, since it does have the potential to die off in 7 billion years? No, I mean, that's a long time, but like considering that it will have eventually fade off.
Sure. Limited in two important ways. I'd like to answer the question that way. One way is sure, it'll eventually go away. I think in terms of us thinking about human population, I think just, you look at the longevity of species, we'll be long gone for a variety of reasons. Even if we do well, we'll be long gone before the sun burns out. So I'm not so worried about the sun burning out, but the flip piece of your question really has to do with the fact there is a constrained amount of sunlight that's flowing to the earth at any given time. It's a fixed flow. Now it's plenty of flow. It's not like we've got plenty of sunlight that's landing on the earth to run our economy on. So that's not really problematic, but it is a limited flow. It's like if you turn the water knob on and you have a continuous flow, there's a continuous flow, but it has a certain rate of flow. And that's what you got to deal with, is that rate of flow we got from the sun. So that's what we have on that front. All right, I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about a model that is discussed in the reading that's actually, it's been an important way of thinking about humans' impact on the planet. I didn't have you do the footprint exercise this year just because I felt like we were doing a little bit too much and I just wanted to cut back a little bit, but the footprint model kind of deals with this a little bit. People live in different ways on the planet. Different cultures live in different ways on the planet. When you think about the impact of a given population size, there's this sort of basic model that was developed. It's an important one to sort of have in your mind, which is that the impact of a population, which is on the right-hand side of the equation there, the impact of any given population is a function of how big the population is, times how much stuff is being consumed per person, times the impact of every unit of consumption on the planet. And people call it the IPAT model. IPAT, impact equals population times affluence times technology. And it's important to the whole discussion of population because a human being living in the United States, in terms of our impact on the planet, is vastly greater than a person living in Bangladesh, which has a very low rate of consumption per person. So the rate of consumption is very different. You can alter that impact by altering technology. A person in the United States who is consuming less and consuming materials produced through renewable energy and local production is consuming much less than a human being in the United States who's consuming something differently. So it is very important to understand that depending on where you are in the world, whether you're in the so-called developing world or developing countries or the global north or the global south, as we sometimes call them, there's very different distributions associated with this model. So if you look at population, wealth, income, and resource use, it's very different for developed and developing countries. The developed countries produce lots more waste. Even though we have a much smaller population, they use a lot more resources, even though we have a much smaller population. We have a much larger wealth and income. So it's very important to understand this, that depending on how humans live, they have very different impacts. And this is where some of the criticism of the focus on population really came in, is that it's not about number of people. It's about number of people times resource consumption times impact per resource consumption. So it's a lot more complicated than simply looking at number of people, which is a sort of trope that people fell into. You look at China, 1.4 billion people, 7 trillion pounds of CO2 based on consumption per person, and you look at the United States, much fewer people, but nearly the same CO2 coming out of it, because the resource consumption per person is much higher in the United States. So anyways, you could play that out for many different countries and see different things, depending on the particular country you're looking at. You'd see very different results in this. And yeah, I'm just going to show you some images of, just sort of thinking about resource consumption. This is this neat photographic project that you can look it up online, where someone basically took a picture of families across the world and the sort of resources, the food resources that were immediately supporting them. It's quite a beautiful photographic project showing not just the different amounts that people are dependent on, but also the very different food sources that people are living on in different parts of the world. It's kind of a quite beautiful photo essay. It gives you this sense, it gives you a tangible sense of the IPAT model, impact people, resource consumption. You see in some countries, stuff is a lot more packaged, a lot more fossil fuel energy going into the whole chain, in that, many of these particularly less developed countries, you're seeing fruits and vegetables that are much closer to the farm field, a lot less processing, a lot less fossil fuels going into production of those. But at any rate, quite a beautiful set of images of what different people in different parts of the world are surviving off of. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to land. I got a couple minutes. Don't shut your books yet. So if you begin to look at the world in terms of affluence, per capita consumption, you were to express the geographic size of a country based on affluence, you get these maps that are just look really, really sort of distorted. And even if you look at the United States, and this gets very much into this issue of development. A couple of years ago, some folks put together this survey to assess how do people think resources are distributed in the United States, the sort of development pattern in the United States. And this is what people think. They think that the top 20% has about this much of the resources. The 4%, so this is divided into these not quartiles, but 20% categories here. So that's what people think the distribution of wealth is in the country, that the top has, about 50% of the resource, a little bit more than 50% of the resources, and it's divided like that. This is what people think. This is the actual distribution of resources in the United States between different population groups. So and this has been increasing dramatically within my lifetime, dramatic change in the distribution of resources between the very wealthy and the rest of the country. The interesting thing is, if you ask almost all Americans, regardless of their political persuasion, what they think the ideal would be like, they think the ideal is much more distributed. This issue of distribution of resources, population, consumption, these things are all very, very closely related to each other. Didn't get as far as I wanted to today, but that's where I got. And it was an enjoyable discussion for me. And again, make sure you come with your questions, complete them on that shared Google Doc, which is linked for your readings before next class. And be ready to ask those questions. You've got a cool group of people here, real local change agents, who are going to share their knowledge with you, but only if you ask them big questions. Yeah, take care, Chris. Yeah.
I'm sorry I couldn't make the field trip this weekend. I don't know if you got my email, but I had a tournament.
Right, I did. I'm going to send you a alternate assignment. There are several people in your situation.
Okay,
yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay. Hey there.
I will be out on Thursday, which I think you know, but for the questions to.
Yeah, go ahead and put together questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll just submit them on the Google Doc.
Yeah. You brought me snacks. That's how kind of you.
For the resources and going around and seeing where.
Right, I'm gonna send, there's like 4 or 5 people in your situation, and I've decided to put together a little assignment for you because more people had that situation. So hopefully I'll get that out later today.
Okay.
I'll-
Will it be the same thing where we go to the map?
I'm gonna ask you guys to sort of, I tried to see if there was someone who actually had a vehicle. Some of them are close enough that you could walk there. And so I'm gonna ask you to take a look at a couple of them and then just write a little bit of a reflection on your experience. So that's what the assignment would be.
Yeah, we can go.
The reservoir is a little far away, but Plum Creek and OMLPS are just down the road by J House. So those are pretty close. And the solar panel is just on the north end of campus. So those are things you could potentially visit. And I'll just ask you guys to visit 2 of them of your choice and then write a bit of reflection.
Thank you.
Did you have a good weekend?
I did. It was fun. We were in
Sebring,
some place with a P.
someplace with a P.
It's like almost like Pennsylvania, but it's not Pennsylvania.
Not Pittsburgh.
Pennsylvania or something like that. Pennsylvania. It's like 2 hours away from Oberlin, south of Oberlin. It was nice. We were in like this like wooded area. It's close to like this water reservoir. I'm not sure if it was like a dam or anything.
A little park of some sort.
Yeah, and then we had workshops on Saturday where we talked about the community and the environment, which was fun,
Oh,
but
that's
also
great.
very, very long. So it was fun.
You talked about like the natural environment or the environment in terms of people mostly?
We talked about both. Like we talked about the environment of both, like how people interact and just like and relating it to Oberlin and how like the Oberlin experiences with like the community environment,
Right.
and also like the natural environment outside of Oberlin. So like the resources and then like how we can impact that.
Right.
Create more sustainable environments.
Well, hopefully you had a little bit from this class, the few weeks of this class to draw on in your discussion. Good. Okay, cool.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a nice one.
Yep.